Okay, I think we should get started. So hello everyone, and welcome to Talking Headless, a practical guide to headless API-first e-commerce strategies, featuring 3 very different perspectives on headless, but all with the same goal: demystifying, sharing their experience and what they've learned along the way. So please join me in welcoming James Gurd, owner of Digital Juggler and co-host of the Replatform podcast. Hi, James. Thanks for joining us today. I'm personally a fan of your podcast, Replatform. Thanks for helping retailers understand more about the technologies available to them. Can you tell the audience a bit about yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Rachel. How are you today?
Good. Thank you. How are you?
Yeah, good. Thanks very much. So I'm an independent e-commerce consultant. My background was head of e-commerce and retail, and I spent 13 years as an independent consultant. I focus on e-commerce strategy and replatforming. So I spend a lot of time helping businesses through the process of technology selection and implementation, not from the technical solution side, which is more what Joe and Tom will be representing today, but more from a business context and helping them to understand why they're making decisions.
That's great. Thanks, James. I actually forgot to introduce myself. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Tonner. I'm from Klevu, and I'll be hosting today. And Joseph McDermott is also at Klevu, Senior Solution Architect. Hi, Joseph. Thanks for joining. I always love hearing you speak because you have this knack for communicating highly technical concepts simply. Can you tell the audience a bit about you and a bit about Klevu?
Sure. Thank you for the kind introduction, first of all, Rachel. So I'm a senior solution architect at Klevu. Klevu is an API-first AI-powered discovery suite. What does this mean? We can power on-site search on e-commerce websites ranging from Magento, Shopify, BigCommerce to any platform out there. And what we do is we connect shoppers with the products they're looking for, trying to find more quickly and ultimately generate sales through doing that. A bit of my background, I was a developer for many years, leading up until this role, and I've joined Klevu, and now I get the privilege of talking on things like this for Klevu.
Thanks, Joe. And finally, Tom Mccall, who is co-founder of Tom & Co., a headless Magento agency, who built the amazing and headless Oliver Bonus, Vashi, Agent Provocateur websites. Hi, Tom, welcome. Can we get an intro?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rachel, and thanks for having us. I'm the founder and director of a Magento agency called Tom & Co. In a previous life, I was a developer, and I then worked at a leading branding and marketing agency as their head of digital before starting Tom & Co about 10 years ago. We now work with lots of fantastic clients and well-known high street retailers, some of the ones you've just mentioned there. And what's unique about us is we fully committed to headless many years ago, and we actually only build headless websites.
That's awesome. Well, I will hand the webinar over to each of you in a moment, but first, just a bit of housekeeping. Audience, you can please ask your questions in the Q&A you'll see at the bottom of your screen as we go through the webinar, and we will answer a few live at the end of the webinar. But also, we're going to respond to each and every question we get after the webinar via email, so please feel free to just ask away. And here is the agenda. Our expert panel is going to talk you through what is headless, help you decide whether or not it's right for your business, and practical strategies so no one ends up on a road to nowhere. You may or may not have noticed the marketing team had a bit of fun on this, and you may get a prize out of this. So there will be 5 references to Talking Head songs in this webinar. Once you get them all, write a message in the chat to the app panelists with all 5 song names. And the first 5 people to get it will each get £20 voucher of your choice. If only one person gets it, then lucky you, that person will get £100. So good luck. Okay, so we've got a jam-packed webinar for you. But before we start, our panelists would like to just get a feel for who we have in the room. So I'm going to put up a poll now. Okay, so there's 4 questions in this poll. Do you use multiple front ends? For example, a separate mobile app, website, point of sale. So just answer yes, no, or don't know. 2, do you use multiple backends? For example, Magento, Klevu, postcode anywhere, etc. Yes, no, or don't know. Now, if you are working for an agency or something like that, just answer for a majority of your clients as well. Number 3, do you use a headless approach? Yes, no, or don't know. Okay, we've got about half people have answered so far. If we could get a few more, that would be awesome. Do you have a PWA or progressive web app? Yes, no, or don't know. Okay, I'll just give a few more moments. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now, and then I will display the results and we can have a look. Okay, so for question number 1, we kind of expected most people to say yes, so that is along the same lines. Do you use multiple backends? Yes, the same. We expected quite a lot of people to say that. A majority of people on this are not using a headless approach, and a majority don't have a PWA. So does that give you guys a good starting point? Yeah, cool.
Yep.
All right, so I will hand this over to you now, James Gurd. Thank you.
Wonderful. So first things first, we're going to just get the context set for this about why we're talking about headless, and focus on what are common business challenges and what are e-commerce teams trying to achieve. So I'm talking about from my experience, I've worked with a lot of different brands and where they're, what their typical struggles are and what they're trying to resolve, because this then leads on to Joe and Tom, who will dive more into the technical implications. So let's start off by talking about the common business challenges e-commerce teams face. Now, obviously, there's a lot of jargon, and Joe's going to demystify that for you, but I'm going to focus on the business challenges. So let's go through some of those common business challenges. I've picked out 4 key ones. Now, there are lots of others, but these are ones that I typically see people talking about more and has more an impact on their day-to-day operational capabilities. So number 1 is no platform is 100% perfect unless you build it from ground up yourself in-house, and very few businesses have the resources and budgets to do that themselves. There are always functional gaps, and that either means there's workarounds required where you try and bend the platform to suit what you want, or you change your processes to fit in with how the platform does something, or you have to invest in customization or third-party plugins and apps. And that's a normal part of e-commerce, but that adds support and maintenance effort. Costs can also spike as you grow. The more customization you do at the back end of the application, the more challenges it brings in things like upgrades, etc. A good example where functional gaps creates an issue is around multi-store and international. So domain setups, URL structures for international sites. Each platform does it slightly differently. The extent to which you can fully control the URLs and how you want that website to be structured in terms of its taxonomy. Now, to do it exactly how you want can add a lot of complexity, or it can not be achievable within a platform. The second thing is being frustrated by limitations in e-commerce CMSs. So this is templating engines, native page builders. Good examples being where you might want a component for, say, something like customer reviews. You might want it to work as a carousel that's scrollable and be able to set rules of which type of reviews you bring in, or manually control the reviews you show. But that template doesn't exist. So you either have to wait for developer resource to build it, or you have to try and hack an existing template to fit with what you're trying to build. So this can sometimes create inefficiencies in content production. It's not always easy to control every part of the site as well, unless you have invested in enterprise CMSs. So sometimes people get held back in terms of the changes they want to make. Reliance on developers means that maybe changes don't get made because actually the time and effort to do that means you've missed the opportunity, and it slows people down. A good example I've seen is where people have tried to make a change to a particular component for it to suit a specific campaign, but they can't do that. They can't make that naturally themselves. They have to go back to their development agency to make that. That has to be fitted in and prioritized accordingly. So sometimes even simple things can slow people down. Now, the one caveat I will put on this is that this isn't the unique preserve of Headless. And obviously CMS solutions can be resolved outside of the Headless setup, but we're talking about what the common challenge is to set the context for then how Headless helps and enables this. Another key issue is platforms also using their own programming language. So, for example, Shopify uses Liquid for its themes, which means developers have to adapt and then become proficient in using those specific languages. So that requires a little bit of training. Depending on which platform it is, the training demands can be higher than others. That also can cause an issue if you get a new developer in. For them to hit the ground running, they've got to come up to speed with it. It also means that if you're trying to take control of things in-house, then recruiting for people becomes a little bit of an extra challenge because the talent pool gets restricted based on how the particular templating engine works. And the fourth common challenge is performance. So I think everyone's pretty conversant now with the impact of page speed, not just from a conversion user experience, but also now in ranking. Core Web Vitals is due to be baked into the algorithm in the UK, I think from June onwards, they've said. So performance is absolutely essential. And as businesses go down their evolution path in e-commerce, more third parties get plugged in, more features get added, more capabilities get baked into pages, and you often get a lot of code bloat. And you get a lot of technical debt that builds up that isn't always addressed. And sometimes you can't address that because you can't actually control and change that yourself. So performance is really important, and making sure that you're able to get pages as lightweight and efficient as possible. And I know the architecture of speed is an area that Tom will explain in more detail later and far more eloquently than I can. So those are the core common challenges that I'm seeing e-commerce teams face. So now let's focus on to what does this mean? What do e-commerce businesses really want to achieve? So if we know the challenges, we can understand the requirements, and the requirements are what drives technology decisions. And this is where I come from. All the projects I work on is if people don't understand what they're trying to achieve and what they're trying to change, they can't possibly evaluate the technology in light of that because they don't know how they're evaluating it. So a few key things before Joe and Tom overlay the technical implications. So you've got to be able to deliver the best possible user experience. So fast and reliable doesn't just mean your core web vitals look great. It means your perceived speed of site is really good to the user. So when they're browsing around, they're getting the level of user experience. So the two together are really important. And that also helps assuage concerns of C-suite investors. Page speed commonly gets thrown around in investor circles about, you should be having a site that loads quicker than 1 second without necessarily understanding what that really means or the implications. So there's a lot of sensitivity around speed and performance at the moment. It's also about how sites perform when connections are poor. It's very easy to demonstrate speed on a good connection on a really good Wi-Fi, if you're lucky to have a good Wi-Fi, although that's never guaranteed in the UK. But what about when you've got on a mobile connection and the signal's dropping in and out? How good is the performance? How does the website respond and cope with that? The next thing is people are wanting increasingly to remove platform constraints created by native functionality and especially like the CMS capabilities, because very, very few e-commerce platforms have mature enterprise level content management baked in, and that's not typically what an e-commerce platform is designed to do. You can be limited by the number of templates. You can be limited by a particular capability around product configurators, product bundles, and not being constrained by that actually helps e-commerce teams then to just get on with doing what they want to do, which is make the presentation layer look and work how they need it to. So with product configurations, a good example of what we've seen with several clients is where they want to put product configurators together in bundles, but they can't combine all the different types of products that they want to, like combining configurables and simples into a simple bundle or into bundle selections. So sometimes you get a basic functionality you want to extend that you can't easily when you're using like the native backend capabilities. And the next one is flexibility and agility of a front-end release. When your front end is coupled with your back end, then obviously you've got to think about the development cycles, the release schedules. You can't do things independently, and that can slow teams down when they want to make quick changes to the front end, but that has a dependency from a back end coding point of view as well. And then I guess the two last ones, speeding up integration for third-party tools. You want to integrate an AI ML search and merge tool like Klevu. You want to change your postcode lookup and validation software. How can you do that quickly and easily? And then the final one on the technical level as well is removing unnecessary code from themes and templates. Having done a lot of work with WordPress, even on my own website, if you take native themes, there's a lot of code in there that you don't actually use because they're built to suit a generic level of use cases that don't actually necessarily represent what your site needs. So you can have a lot of extra code in that page that can cause like unnecessary performance challenges. Actually, if you're able to sculpt an experience that is only delivering what you need it to do at page level, you can help to take away some of that unnecessary coding. So that's what e-commerce teams want. So that all sounds like great, let's deliver that, and well, brilliant, let's all go headless. But one of the things we want to talk to you today is about the realities of this, because we do need a reality check. So let's now talk about the reality check of headless. And one of the things I come up against a lot is people saying, well, we should go headless, shouldn't we? Because that's going to fix all the problems. And the answer to this is that a technology in itself does not fix all of your issues. So we want everyone to bear this in mind when listening to what we're talking about and listening to the technical implications we'll come on to next. Is, you know, businesses are complex. It's not uncommon to spend a lifetime piling up issues, and then you reach breaking point, and then you look to re-platform to fix it. And technology itself isn't a band-aid to all those problems. So you need to understand what headless means and what it does and what it achieves. But it's a systems architecture approach. It's not a panacea to all problems. It doesn't solve all your internal process problems. So before you start burning down the house and changing, you still got to understand that you need robust processes, even in a headless setup, for code control, for front-end releases. You've got to understand what the implications of going to a new setup and changing the head of your stack is. So you need clarity of what your head will be. You know, is it the same CMS you're already using, but in a headless state? Is it a new CMS? Are you building a custom front-end framework using Vue Storefront, React, Angular, etc.? What is the technology you're using? What are the implications? And what does that change with you internally in terms of your processes, your capabilities, your skills, your resources? A good example, brand I worked with recently, they want to move to headless and they want to bring all the front-end development in-house because they want to have complete control over the experience layer across all of their channels. But they have to build up an engineering team in order to do that. They need an engineering lead to establish the define and manage DevOps and align that with the application management and ensure that the environments are set up correctly so that they can actually manage their releases properly in a controlled way. So all of a sudden, making these changes can create different dependencies. So it's really, really important to understand that going headless can solve some existing business problems, but also adds new challenges that you have to think about and understand what the implications are. So with that context, hopefully that gives you a bit of flavor for common business challenges, where e-commerce teams are trying to go. And with that context about what does headless do, let's hand over to Joe now, who will demystify some of the jargon that I've thrown around at you.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, James. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners are going to resonate with everything you've said there, because if we look at the poll results, a lot of people are not using headless at the moment. They don't have PWAs, but they're on a headless webinar. So a lot of the listeners might be being asked to make tentative decisions about, should we have a PWA? Should we go headless? Should we do all these things? So what I'm going to try and do now is try and, exactly as James said, demystify what all these terminologies mean. Try and give a bit of an overview of exactly a very simple explanation of what they mean. And then Tom is going to pick that up and show what that means in the real world and real world examples of that. So let's start with the first one, which is headless. What does it actually mean? Because the term itself is actually a little bit misleading. Your website needs a head and it needs a body. Let's just define those things first so we can help a bit with that. So the head of a website or an application is the user interface. It's what the customers interact with. So sometimes referred to as the front end. So images, text, forms on a screen, things like that. That's the head of your website. And the body is the logic behind that interface, like loading products, placing orders, things like that, sometimes referred to as the back end. Now, of course, we need both of these things. We need a head and we need a body. And if we look at some of the common e-commerce frameworks out there, such as Magento, Shopify, BigCommerce, these frameworks are not headless. I've put in brackets here by default because they can be made to be headless, but by default, out the box, they are not headless. You get a head, which is HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and Liquid in Shopify. And you have a body, which is PHP, .NET, or MySQL database, things like this. These two things are tightly connected, and changes to one of them usually requires changes to the other, and if you're not using a headless application. So With headless, the key difference, the definition is that it's the head separated from the body. Okay, you still need the head, but it's separated. And you can add more heads and you can have multiple bodies. So in terms of heads, you could have a website, a mobile app, or a point of sale in store. And you can have multiple bodies like a catalog for loading categories and products, a different search provider, all provided by different things, different bodies there. And one of the crucial parts of headless is these are all completely separate and they talk to each other via APIs. I'm going to define what API means in a moment. But the key thing here is that you can update one without updating the other. So you can actually manage them separately. It's a really important thing to understand with headless. So if you need a new look and feel, you can change your head or add a new head, or need a new search provider like Klevu, for example, you can just add a new body. So let's show this with a little bit of an example here. So let's consider that this is a headless setup. So we've got a front end over here. We've got the head, which is a website, a normal website. It might be written in React or Angular or Vue or something like that, but it's a headless front end. Over here, we've got two bodies, both powered by Magento. This one over here is the catalog, so things like the product management and the category management. And then when a customer makes a search, it's actually Magento that is going and finding the results. So if someone searches for red shoes, Magento is going to go find the products and return them. And then there's various other bodies over here, all of which might be Magento for handling different parts of an e-commerce store, like the carts and the orders, things like that. So this is our headless setup. Now, if we want to add a new mobile app and we're headless, then we don't need to change anything down here because we've already got everything we need. It's already functioning as a website. All we need to do is add a new head. So we're adding a new presentation layer. So you could have your mobile app team, your front end team, work on this completely independently on their own, and they should be able to add a new mobile app. Similarly, if you wanted to add a point of sale in store, over here we can add a head for that. And there's no need to add or change any of this in theory, because all of this should already exist. So you're just reusing functionality that's there. And it means that your front-end team can work on their own to make this look as they want to. Now, the same also applies with the bodies. Let's say in this example here, everything is powered by Magento. But if you want to do a migration, let's say you want to switch to BigCommerce, then you switch out these bodies to BigCommerce. And of course, the cart and order API would also switch to BigCommerce over here. But this is something that your backend team can work on. The front end of your website, the mobile app, the POS, they don't necessarily need to change because the way your website looks and feels and the way customers interact with it, you might want to keep that completely the same. So you can have a single team work over here on switching out these backends and not need to change anything on your front end if you're in a headless architecture. And then, of course, you could go one further and use something like Klevu to switch out over here. So you've got your catalog and your search powered by Klevu, whereas over here, these still might be powered by things like BigCommerce or Magento. So it gives you the power to switch out your logic providers as you wish, as well as switching out your UX as you wish without being tied to, okay, it's Magento. So when we add something, we need to upgrade Magento or we need to change something in Magento, we have to change the head as well. You don't have those restrictions anymore. And then you'll notice there's a gap here. So if you wanted to add a new feature, like a recommendations provider, then in this instance, you'd add your new backend over here, or there'd be one provided for you, like a third party like Klevu has a recommendations API available. So your front end team just needs to add the UX to that and connect it to an existing API, and you can switch it out as you please. So that's obviously it's a very simplified overview of headless, but hopefully it gives you a flavor. I'm going to define some of the other terms in a moment, and then Tom is going to go further into what this means in the real world. Let's just define a few more things for you. So API, what does this actually mean? So application programming interface is its definition, but ultimately it's a set of functions that allows the head to talk to the body. So for example, this is a set of functions. Here's one, here's another, here's another. Search for shoes, get the products, add to cart, place order. And if this list goes on with all the functionality of your website, where your head needs to communicate with the body, and this whole set of functions together, they make up all of the APIs of your application. So that's roughly what it means. It's your head talking to your body. SPA is another one that you may hear from time to time, especially when we're talking about headless. What does it mean? So the absolute best definition for this is just its actual, what it actually stands for, which is single page application. It's an application which is loaded once, and that's it. Once it's loaded, that page will then change as you interact with it. It's usually loaded by a JavaScript technology. So when you first load the page, you get the website, and then as you interact with it, JavaScript will then use the APIs to replace the content as you interact. And Tom will do a better job of talking about this in a moment, so I'll leave that for him. But ultimately, single page application is what it stands for. When we look at the likes of Magento, Shopify, and BigCommerce, these are not SPAs. They're not single page applications because, as you know, every page you visit is a new request. So when you click on a product or when you click on a category, the head and the body, they all reload together, and it's reloaded every single time. So it's not a single page, they are multiple pages. So that's the difference between single page and multiple page applications. These are technologies, so these are JavaScript technologies which can be used to create SPAs. So Angular, React, and Vue, they are JavaScript frameworks. They're not, you wouldn't describe these as SPAs. These are toolkits that can be used to create SPAs. So that's the definition of these things here, and they're all very good. What does PWA actually mean? Okay, this is the last one before I hand over to Tom, but this is quite a common question, especially when comparing to SPA. Like, what's the difference between SPA and PWA is a common question that I hear. Progressive web application, it's actually a methodology. It's a set of rules that an application can use to create a website which behaves like an app. And the way it does this is with a PWA, the user experience is gradually enhanced depending on the device. So if you've got a brand new mobile device, you can take advantage of the latest features with this progressive web application, things like voice search or image capturing, things like that. However, the functionality of the website still works properly on older devices. So you can still purchase a product, you can still do all the normal e-commerce things, you just don't have the bells and whistles. And this is all within the same application. And the application itself adheres to a core set of standards. So things like responsive, safe, installable. There's quite a big list of these things which you have to adhere to for an application to be called a PWA. I'm not going to go into all of that today because you can do quite a lot of reading on it, but I just want to summarize everything here with this one jargon buster slide before I hand over to Tom. So headless, the idea is about separating the head from the body. API is the communication between the head and the body. A SPA is a single page application. PWA is an application which behaves like a native app. And then the final one, PWA and SPA together, is just a combination of these two. It's a single page application which behaves like a native app. So hopefully that has helped, and hopefully it hasn't made you even more confused, but I'm going to hand over to Tom now, who's going to give you some real world insight into this.
Thanks, Joseph. So hopefully everyone now has a better understanding of the business needs and why you might be thinking about headless, and also kind of demystifying some of the technical speak around headless. I want to give you some real world examples of headless and why you might want to consider it as the way that you implement your e-commerce website. So I'm going to start by explaining our journey that we went on with headless. So that you can understand what drove us to go down that route. It starts about 8 years ago, and at the time we had quite large frustrations with the front end system of the platform we were using then, which is Magento 1. It wasn't really the fault of Magento 1, it's more the fault of what's called monolithic systems. Monolithic systems are where everything is essentially bundled into one. and they have a tendency to force certain front-end practices, such as what languages you should be using, what methodologies you should be using. And they also merge a lot of logic with presentation. And it's not unusual in those systems for a back-end developer, a logical developer, to be working in exactly the same file as a front-end developer, a presentational developer. And that obviously can cause some problems. So we were looking for ways to improve our efficiency and flexibility around how we were building websites. And at the time, we turned initially to two of the biggest CSS frameworks out there. Two frameworks called Bootstrap, which is built by Twitter, and Foundation, which is built by an American agency trying to solve a similar problem to us. The issue was that both of these frameworks still existed or had to exist inside the monolithic system. And our hopes for improvement after several attempts at trying to use these frameworks within builds led to disappointment. And ultimately, we found ourselves putting complexity on top of complexity. So we did what all good developers do, and we turned to the internet and did some Google searching to try and find an alternative solution. And I remember we came across a small GitHub project, which was a sort of a hackathon attempt at making Magento headless. So as you can tell, headless has been around for a long time. This little project was really just a concept, but for us it sparked an idea, and perhaps even a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. That idea has become to be known as headless e-commerce. And if you fast forward 8 years, we now have 35 headless websites. They're processing over £250 million of transactions. And what's really telling is we have no traditionally built websites anymore. We've fully committed to headless when we saw the power and capabilities of building websites like that. So what exactly makes headless so great? Well, first we need to understand a little bit more about what headless is in a practical term. So basically, headless, as you've already heard, is decoupling the front end from the back end, essentially your presentational layer from your logical side of your system. In doing so, this means that you actually need to have a new front end, because you're no longer going to be using the out-of-the-box front end of Magento or Shopify or so on. And this is actually where the hidden value is. This is beyond the many heads and the many bodies that Joe was describing to you, which of course is a massive advantage as well. But this hidden value is in this SPA or this PWA approach. You're probably more familiar with PWA, but SPA, single page application, is the real core of how a headless website is built on the front end. And it is a completely different approach to one of a traditional site. So the fundamental difference between these two is that a traditional website, the ones that a lot of you are still currently running, they will build the presentation layer on the server. So they will take the data from the database and they will turn it into a pretty looking page, and then they will send it off to the browser. A headless approach and an SPA approach flips that around. So the server actually only passes the data to the browser, and then the single page application that is running in the browser builds that page. Now, this actually opens up some real opportunities, because basically, if you think about it, when you're building it on the server, you have to account for all environments that you're sending to. That could be sending it to a large 27-inch desktop computer on a very, very fast internet connection versus sending it to a mobile phone on a weaker, poor 3G connection. So you have to account for all of these different environments that you're going to send it to in a traditional website. Whereas in a headless approach, because you're only sending the data and the page is built on the device, that means that while you're building the page, you're already aware of your environment. So you can make fundamental decisions about how you build that page. And this is where a lot of the speed and flexibility comes in. If you think about navigations, for example, So on a traditional website, you will prepare a mega menu, mega nav, which is the big drop-down nav you usually see, but you'll also prepare an off-canvas, which is the mobile navigation. And you actually have to send both because you don't know if it's going to be on a desktop or a mobile site. That is how responsive websites work. When you're working with an SPA, when you get to the point of building your navigation, you know that you only need to build one of them, depending on the device or the environment that you're in. So that is one example of how you can fundamentally change the way that you build a page using a headless approach. So again, why would we do headless? Well, essentially, if you sort of distill it down, again, beyond the many heads and the many bodies that we looked at earlier, is because headless works more like an app, which means it feels more like an app. It's faster, it's more flexible, and it's better for developers. And ultimately, that leads to more freedom in creativity when you're designing and building these pages. So I want to break that down a little bit further and go into each of those points. So talking about performance now, this baby's got it right. He knows there's been a lot of talk about the fact that page load speed has a direct correlation to conversion. And people talk about this a lot. It's true. But it's really important to understand what performance is and how it should be measured. There are two types of performance when you're looking at a website. One is the page load speed. That's more like the UX of the site. So how fast it feels to browse. And the other is page load score. That's much more from an SEO point of view. Although people mix these two up and think that that scoring really dictates the actual speed and how the website feels. So it's important to, first of all, separate those two forms of performance. Then it's important to understand from a headless approach, when you're using a single page application to build your page, headless SPAs are inherently much faster to browse. That's because they are like an application. But headless SPAs are also slower for initial page load, and that's because you have to send the application on the initial page load. If you think about it like an application on your desktop, for example, Microsoft Word, when you open Microsoft Word for the first time, it takes a little while. That's because it's doing something called bootstrapping. It's starting up essentially. But once it's started and it's up and running, it's very, very quick. Indeed, it is instantaneous. When you press a button, you get an immediate result. That is a good analogy for how a single page application works. First of all, we send the application in the first request. Then after that, it's up and running. We only have to send small amounts of data to load subsequent pages. So this gives you a massive advantage in browsing. And when you think about how much time people spend on your site, I suspect a lot of you will see that in terms of around about 5 minutes on time on site. So for the initial page load, that's only done once, and then they spend a good 4 minutes, 58 seconds browsing your website. That's when an SPA is really, really fast, and that's where you get the advantages. It's also a huge advantage on mobile. So the way that, just because of the way that an SPA works, it means it's natively faster on a mobile device than a traditional website. That's because you have to send less data for each page load. And of course, mobile phones are sensitive to data. They don't always have as fast connections, or they may even be, you may even be moving at speed, which makes their connections even worse. They also suffer from poor latency, which is the time in which, if you send a request, how long it takes you to get a response back from the server. And there's a great example of where you get a huge advantage from a headless SPA approach, and that is on a train. So if you've ever been on a train and you've clicked a link and then seen a white screen for quite a few seconds, perhaps even 10 or 20 seconds, that is because your request was sent while you were connected to one phone tower. And as the train has been flying down the tracks, it's actually disconnected from that tower and connected to a new one before your responses come back. Then if that happens, lots of clever rerouting needs to take place to get your response to the new tower. That takes time, and that's why you see a blank page. And sometimes it won't even get it to the tower on time for you to move on to the next one. And that can produce a very long white page that you're looking at. With a headless SPA site, because on the server side, it's not creating the page before sending back, it means that response can be much faster, something like 10 to 20 milliseconds. Which means the chances of you dropping your connection from the tower before you get the response are very low. So you actually get a better experience than you would from a traditional website. There's also been lots of white papers on this kind of CRO, this correlation between site speed and conversion rate. The big names have done it: Amazon, Google, Walmart, and the list goes on. They were all looking at traditional websites where every page load is the same. It's a new page and you have to download it again. So where they say that the initial page load, if it is slow, that has a direct relationship to your CRO, that is true. But within an SPA or a headless approach, those subsequent page loads happen very, very, very quickly. So, and in some cases, it's near instantaneous. So that allows for that faster browsing experience, which is what those white papers were looking at, how quickly pages load as you browse through the website. And then just moving on to the second thing. So looking at performance from an SEO point of view is very different. This is the bit where people often confuse the performance of a website with actually its SEO performance. And they do that because they look at the scoring mechanism designed for initial page load rather than the combined experience. And it is also an area where headless SPAs struggle. It is much, much harder to get a headless site to score well in SEO scoring than it is a traditional website. And that is because they measure on the initial page load only. And that is where you have to send the application and you have to also bootstrap, so start up that application. That initial part takes time, and that's where the scoring comes in. It's not impossible to score well with an SPA, you can do it. And Google has introduced Core Web Vitals, which is basically a definition of how they score the performance of your website. This helps massively because it's given us visibility around what we actually need to do to score well. Traditional sites and headless websites are both struggling to score well, but there are changes being made to Core Web Vitals every day before it becomes a part of Google's scoring algorithm later on in the year that are aiding people to better improve that. But when thinking about going headless, this is one of the big things that you need to think carefully about, and you shouldn't underestimate the challenge of achieving a good score from a SEO scoring point of view. And then just lastly on performance, I just really wanted to touch quickly on scale. So this is also something that is not talked about in the world of headless that much, but you get inherent advantages from headless when scaling up. So as your traffic is building, and I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this over the past year with a lot of the bricks and mortar retail spend coming online, and clients seeing rapid growth, up to 300 or 400% we've seen. Being able to scale up is a really important thing to be able to do without having too much hassle. Now, headless actually aids that because by moving the presentation layer from the server to the client, you're essentially moving some of that processing of building a page from your own server onto the client's browser. That in essence is distributing that processing. And you can think about it. You can think about it like this: in the 90s, there used to be a screensaver. I don't know if it's still around, that you could download, and in the background, when you weren't using your computer, it would be trying to calculate and map out the Milky Way. And lots of people were running that screensaver, and that allowed the scientists who were running these projects to get a huge amount of distributed processing power. A headless site with an SPA is very, very similar to that. As your numbers go up, so your concurrent users on your site, essentially you have more people and more browsers that are doing some of the processing for your server. And that aids in scaling up and making it much easier to handle. So that's performance. Now I just want to talk about the flexibility and integrations of a headless approach. And we all know that being flexible is good, but what does headless SPAs enable in terms of flexibility? So as you know, we talked about earlier, it's about decoupling the front end from the back end. That also means you are abstracting and removing data from the presentation layer. And instead, the headless front end, the SPA, has to build the page each time. This means that it is natively capable of manipulating the page as a whole. That's very different to a traditional page, because, a traditional site, because a traditional site will build the page on the server and send it. It doesn't really need to manipulate the page in the browser. And you can think about an SPA like this. If you have a piece of paper and you write on that piece of paper with a pencil, an SPA, if you were to then change what you wanted to have on that page, an SPA would rub out the pencil marks and replace it with what the new content is. There's a massive advantage working like this, because if parts of the page don't need to change, you don't need to rub them out. So for instance, if you have a header, a navigation, a drop down, an off-canvas menu, a footer, filters, all of these things can be left on the page, and the SPA can just change the bit of the content that needs to be changed. A great example of where you get a massive amount of performance out of this is moving from one product page to another product page. Very little is actually changing on that page. You only need to change product titles and descriptions and prices. The structure is exactly the same. So an SPA has that advantage of not having to rebuild the page each time, but instead manipulate it. And because it naturally has to manipulate the page, you have a huge amount of flexibility. You also move away from the limitations of the back end. So in my world, in our world, in Tom & Co, we deal with Magento, which is a fantastic platform. It has a huge amount of flexibility in product setup, but there are limitations. And one great example of that is the fact you cannot put configurable products, so products with variants, like a dress with different sizes, inside a bundle. So you might want to bundle that dress with some shoes or an earring or earrings. When you decouple the front end and you have your own, those rules no longer apply to you because you control the presentation layer. And this is where the flexibility comes in. So on many of our sites, we actually have configurables inside bundles. And that's just one example of where that flexibility comes in. This gives designers much more freedom to do what they want, which is what designers love to do. And it's how you can be creative. Another good example of this is if you have a product configuration. We have some clients who have product configurations that have 10 or more steps in them. If you've had that experience, you might know that your developers or your agency have decided to implement a JavaScript framework to deal with that highly configurable part of the site. That's because they allow you to manipulate the page and give you a lot more flexibility. A headless approach means your entire website is like that. Everything can be manipulated on every page at any given moment. And that, again, gives you huge amounts of flexibility. As well as that, in integrations, you have more options as to how you can work. Integrations on a headless approach can quite often cut out the middleman. And that middleman might be, Magento or Shopify or BigCommerce, and sort of replace your platform. with the ones I've just given as examples. It's all the same when you're working in a traditional site. The backend needs to talk to the integration, and then that puts it into the presentation layer that's then sent to the customer. There's lots of steps, and having a middleman slows things down and controls your ability to be flexible. That is not the case when you have a headless front end, because with a headless front end, you can talk directly to the backend. So Klevu is a great example where if you're searching on the site, you can basically pull results straight onto the front end and present them how you want without having to worry about it going through the back end. And just lastly, I wanted to talk about development. From a development point of view, there are some unseen advantages. And if you do have an in-house development team, this is a great thing to talk to them about. But essentially going headless, because it separates the front end from the back end, it gives you a few advantages. Things like faster development cycles. If you want to change the front end of your site to put in a new banner or to put in a new content management component, you can do that without having to touch the back end of the site at all. So that allows you to be faster. It also means your developers are more specialized. When I was a PHP developer many years ago, I had to edit templates that had the presentational layer in there, and quite often edited the presentational layer. By separating those two out, our backend developers never touch at the front end of the site, the presentation, and our presentation developers never touch the back end. That means that you're less likely to adversely affect other parts of the system, and it's less disruptive for deployments. You can deploy just the front end of your site without having to worry about the back end. And indeed, actually, we quite often deploy back end changes a day or two before we implement the front end changes, which gives us a bit more time to test in production before releasing it to customers. But I would say you need to remember, this is not a simple technical switch. Moving from a traditional built website to a headless one is a completely different way of building a website. And your developers will have to reskill and learn new ways of building, or perhaps you'll even need to hire in new developers. But I do know one thing for sure. In closing, after doing this for 8 years, I do know that it's a better way to build websites. Indeed, I believe it is the future. And I'm very happy to see that people are taking notice of headless e-commerce these days. So I will leave you with one thought, which is this headless, although it's not a silver bullet, and it's not exactly the solution to all of your problems, it is the natural progression for the web. First, we had desktop only, and I don't know if anyone was building websites 25 years ago like me, but it was just desktop only you had to worry about. Then you had adaptive, where you built a desktop page and a mobile page completely separately. Now we have responsive websites where you build one page and it responds to the device it's being displayed on. And next, I believe for everyone, at some point, it will be headless e-commerce that you will be using. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Joseph, McDermott, James, Gurd, and Tom McCall. That was a fantastic opportunity to hear 3 different perspectives, skill sets, and viewpoints. So thank you so much. Just a reminder to our audience, if you haven't already, please do ask questions in the Q&A. We've only got about 5 minutes left in the call. So just, ask your questions now, and we will come to them in a moment. Tom, James, and Joseph, if you had one thing that you want people to know walking away from this webinar, what would it be? And just be really quick. Tom?
Yeah, I mean, it would be that headless enables a lot of things, but if you are looking for an extremely fast site with good flexibility, and you have the resources in place to be able to use the new technology, which shouldn't be underestimated, I would really encourage you to try headless.
Cool. And Joseph.
Yeah, just to reiterate what Tom said on his last slide there, headless, it does seem to be the natural progression. So don't be afraid of it. Don't be afraid of the terminology. Lots of people don't fully know what all these terms mean. Just dive into what Tom's described there in terms of what it means for your business and for your dev teams. And yeah, don't be afraid of it is my takeaway.
And James.
I was coming at it from the business drivers thing, and so it's what issues are you what issues you're trying to unpick, and what improvements you're trying to make, and be very clear about them and how you're going to measure them, because if you're moving technology to improve something or to tap into new opportunities, you've got to be able to measure that and validate that it's happening.
Cool. We actually did anybody manage to spot the 5 Talking Heads references? I'm not sure if anybody did. It was quite a difficult challenge. Put them in the chat to all the panelists now if you did.
Let's see who got the most. Surely the most wins, right?
Or any.
Yeah.
You know what? I think we're going to have to do a random. So it's your lucky day if you stayed till the end. We're going to pick 5 random winners. Watch out for an email from me. So we actually have 2 questions. So first, what are the implications for SEO when building headless? i.e., are they resolved lately at the level of search engines themselves? Who wants to take that?
Yeah, I can take that if you want. So I mean, this is a very, very common question for headless, and actually when we started doing this 8 years ago, it's the one thing that nearly derailed our ambitions and prevented us from going forward. Ultimately, it's solvable. So there are many different ways you can approach this problem. Back in the day when we were doing it, we were using an open source piece of software called pre-render. Pre-render would essentially build the page using what's called a headless browser. It's essentially a browser running on a server. And then when Google requests the page, it presents that page to Google rather than the dynamic page. These days, the frameworks, some of the frameworks that Joseph mentioned earlier, they have something called SSR built into them, server-side rendering. It basically means they do the same thing. So they can create a static page that they then send to Google. But increasingly so, Google's working very hard on, I think it's called Green Grass Project, which essentially is their ability to read websites using their own headless browser, Chrome, so that you don't even need to do server-side rendering. So it is a problem that you need to be aware of and need to work out what your solution is for. But it has been solved, and actually there are some upsides. By rendering those pages, you can serve them extremely quickly to Google. On one of our websites, we serve more than 30,000 pages a day to Google because it's realized that it can pick them up very quickly, and so it likes to crawl often.
Thank you, Tom.
I think just to add to that, I mean, from the business perspective, the requirements within your projects don't change. You need to have a technical SEO lead, whether that's in-house or a freelancer or an agency partner who is able to work alongside the developers. So having worked with Tom and the team on a couple of projects, is having that SEO who can sit there and define what those site taxonomies, classifications, indexation controls are, and have that level of discipline from the start. And that needs to be at the start, not thrown in at the last minute. I think that's critical because that enables the development team to ensure that the solution is delivering as close as you possibly can get to your perfect SEO requirements. There's typically always a compromise from perfect SEO to what's a good blend from a UX point of view, and obviously affordable as well.
We have another question from an anonymous attendee. I know we're kind of at the end, but just can you answer, how long does it take to build a typical SPA and PWA Magento project, Tom? Can you answer that quickly?
There are many different approaches that you can take here. You can build it from scratch, which is obviously going to take a lot longer, or you can use frameworks beyond just the JavaScript frameworks we mentioned that take a lot of that legwork out. But I would really compare it to building a traditional website in terms of the size of the project. As long as you're working with a team that are familiar with Headless, the first time will be a much bigger challenge than the 50th time, for example.
Cool. And just one last one, Joseph. Are there limits on the amount of bodies that can be implemented within a headless setup?
No, is the short answer to that. You can have that. That's the genius of Headless, or microservices, if you like. You can have lots of different logical backends, logical bodies, all powering your SPA. I think, as Tom put it in one of his slides, the SPA doesn't care where it gets its data from. It just cares that there's an API there to get that information. So no limits there. Amazing.
Well, thank you all so much. That's all we have time for now. I'm Rachel from Klevu. Hope you found some insights today and enjoyed yourself, everyone. Please be on the lookout for similar content and events from Klevu in the future. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Here, everyone.
Cheers. Bye.